As a reporter who covers the auto industry, Ryan Felton has been to a lot of car dealerships. And they're not, to be frank, the most dynamic environments.
You're just sort of seeing people filling out paperwork and maybe some seem stressed because they need a car.
Ryan works for the Wall Street Journal. And a few weeks ago, he made a trip to Colorado, where he went from one electric vehicle dealership to another, finding people who were pretty psyched to be there.
Kind of like milling about and really intrigued by these like $40,000 to $50,000 cars that they might walk away with for, a fraction of a percent of that cost per month.
And that's because if you're in the market for an EV right now, the market is very, very good. Dealers are working hard to get cars out the door before a federal tax credit expires September 30th. In Colorado, where Ryan went, there are state incentives to the tune of thousands of dollars on top of the federal ones. $65,000 Kia EVs were going for $189 a month before taxes. And some deals were even better.
It's a pretty robust EV market. And, they were offering things like $20 a month leases. So,
whoa!
Yeah.
But come October, the federal tax credit for buying an EV is going away. Under the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, it was set to last until 2032. But President Trump and Congress undid that policy in the tax bill passed in July. After this month, electric cars are simply going to cost more.
People want something that they can afford. And I think that is something that, is going to have to be thought about going forward is, are there going to be EVs that people, want, but also can't afford?
Today on the show, EV Judgment Day is coming. Can the market stand on its own without federal support? Or is the Trump administration killing it? I'm Lizzie O'Leary, and you're listening to What Next TBD, a show about technology, power, and how the future will be determined. Stick around. In the U.S., EVs have long been considered fancy. That's why tax credits are a big deal for them. Ryan says that some of that fanciness goes back to how they're made and what the priority is. To be able to go a long way, to have range, you need a big battery, which is expensive, especially when car makers were first trying to introduce people to the EV concept.
Cars that had smaller batteries and maybe could be something that you use around town or is like a second car at home that maybe only gets driven 100 miles a week or 200 miles a week. Everyone was really focused on getting as much range as possible to kind of alleviate this concern of range anxiety, which again is still very real. But in doing so, you kind of build these batteries that are much larger, cost more, and therefore tack on more cost to consumers. And so, I think that was kind of just a big challenge. Was there was only a couple of cars that were in this sort of more affordable price band, but a lot of EVs were kind of considered luxury products. I mean, I think that there was kind of this, stigma. I don't know if stigma is the right word, but it was perceived as as just this luxury product because it was kind of designed to, be essentially a luxury product where you wouldn't have to worry about all of these things that maybe an EV of, the Nissan Leaf, for example, in 2010 didn't have the biggest range. So it was not the kind of like thing that you could sell for $50,000, $60,000 and get away with.
American consumers first got a taste of EV tax credits back in 2008 with the Energy Improvement and Extension Act. It was a good old-fashioned tax credit, but you had to wait till April 15th for the $7,500.
It's not the easiest thing in the world to be like, oh, I'm going to get $7,500 in April. Maybe I'll bank that to like lower my monthly payment. Like no one thinks like that. Okay, someone probably does, but it's not typical. And the other thing that kind of limited the scope of it was the government capped the number of cars that a company could sell to 200,000. So Tesla and GM for a very long time were the only two companies that were really selling EVs in a significant volume. And they actually clipped that threshold kind of at the start around the start of this decade. So there was kind of this lull and period where some newer companies could still take advantage of it because they hadn't sold 200,000 cars yet. But A, just was this sort of weird sort of credit setup, and B, it wouldn't really last forever for companies that were selling a ton of volume.
Then the Inflation Reduction Act passes 3 years ago. That changed how this tax credit worked. And I guess what? It changed the way people thought about buying an EV?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a big way. The biggest thing being that instead of making it something that you, the buyer, had to take care of, they made it so dealers would be the ones who would fill out the paperwork and get the money back. So you could take that $7,500 and apply it to your monthly payment. And I think in some cases, that's where you could start to see why people would gravitate more toward an EV, where a $35,000 EV suddenly becomes $27,500. Suddenly you have a palatable monthly payment. And I think that really started to drive EV adoption in a big way, just because people could, think about an EV payment the way that they would any sort of payment, instead of just thinking about it as like, April, I'm going to get some money back. And that sort of coincided with the time when the industry itself really started to ramp up building more EV battery plants and making plans to build more EVs in the US. It was just kind of like this real big frenzied moment a few years ago.
One of the things you're describing is this sort of individual behavior nudge, right? Like people act because, hey, I'm going to have a lower monthly payment. My purchase price is going to be cheaper. But of course, there are also industry nudges that come from this, right? You multiply this effect and you start to see it in a much larger way. What does the data tell us about what happened to the EV market after the IRA passed and after consumers got to take advantage of some of these purchase deals?
For the better part of a few years, it was just month over month growth. I mean, I think when I did a story earlier this year, we looked going back to 21, and there was maybe 2 months where there had been a decline. Um, but it was, a fraction of a percent or something like that. So it was just consistent growth month over month of sales, which to me just really underscores the fact of just how much that sort of incentive plays a role for a technology that was still very costly, very new.
When you look at the EV market, what do you think and what do analysts think projecting forward this end of the tax credit might do to the market share?
It's roughly been lately around 7 to 8% for several months now. It's probably going to be above 10, closer to 12% in August. I imagine it'll be close to that as well, if not higher in September. I think for certain it's going to drop a bit, but a company like Tesla still represents a significant portion of EVs sales in the US, and they're still selling at a decent clip. So I think the share itself is going to drop, but you're still going to see EVs being sold on the road because you have a company whose entire business model is predicated on selling EVs, and they do a good job at that. It'll be tough, I think, to kind of really sort out initially because there's going to be a company like Tesla moving ahead. Rivian is moving ahead toward building its next model in the coming year. But I think one thing that's for sure going to happen is a lot of automakers that do both electric cars and gas cars, they're going to start dialing back on their production levels for EVs. Volkswagen has said they're going to dial back production of their SUV, the ID.4. GM has been scaling back shifts for some of their EV models, and I think that that's probably going to be the biggest sort of change in the near term. Is while the companies wait to see what the consumer demand is, they're just going to be making less of these, and I think they're sort of motivated to make less of them now because of so many policy changes that have happened this year in the automotive market.
State and federal regulations have changed the way automakers do what they do for decades. Think about making cars that get better mileage or have fewer emissions. Now, the Trump administration is trying to revoke a lot of those regulations. This kind of change is something automakers have always had to deal with, but never on this scale. And with EVs, many of the effects are magnified. Well, so what do automakers do with that? Automakers are used to trying to adjust to customer demand and to federal rules. Sometimes they furlough in the summer. Things get tooled and retooled. So, how do they watch this moment, and what does that mean for their production capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing that I've been thinking about personally, just as kind of the next sort of moment to watch is Ford's effort that it recently announced to build this sort of lower cost electric truck on this platform that they've designed to make cheap EVs. I think it's going to be a really big tell. They say it's not going to come till 2027, so we're not going to really see that for another year, year and a half. But they're adamant that they're going to put a $30,000 truck on the road that is going to be modern, kind of, meet the sort of moment that Ford and others say exists, where they view companies that coming out of China with the sort of product that they're putting out as a massive threat. It's
Yeah.
sort of like this unknown threat at the moment because these cars aren't here. But if you go to China and you see pictures even just of what sort of cars are driving around there, it's just a much different environment. So I think that there's just this overarching concern that if people get access to those cars here, it could just sort of completely destroy the auto industry. And I'm not the one saying that. I mean, the top lobby group has deemed it an existential threat. So Ford had kind of put all their effort, all their recent efforts around EVs internally to design this production line that could build cheaper EVs overall. And they say this first truck will be $30,000 coming in 2027. I think if you see people glom onto that, it could really be a big tell that of where consumers would want to go, and if Ford's bet is right that people want something that's cheap but also modern and not sort of just like an F-150 that's now an F-150 with a battery. If you see people gravitate toward that, it'll be a big deal, I think. And I think another sort of point to back that up is there was a newer company that says it will still build a truck beginning next year called Slate. They made a lot of
No
headlines.
pun intended. Sometimes we get their mail.
Yes. Do you really?
Yeah.
That's incredible. There's this company that came out last year or earlier this year called Slate Auto. They had hopes to build an EV pickup truck that could be converted into an SUV, kind of like bare bones. That if it had the tax credit would be, approaching $20,000, but it won't anymore. But I think the thing that stuck out to me is like, will they make that truck at that price point? We'll see. But people lost their mind thinking about buying this cool looking truck at a cost a small car today. And again, just kind of like underscores that point that I think that there's this interest and desire there to buy an EV, but until you can actually do it for a significant amount of people, it's just sort of going to be this niche product, most likely.
When we come back, the automotive landscape is shifting. Can car makers keep up? So there's also this question of profitability for the automakers. And, one thing that has always been profitable for American automakers is trucks. They like making trucks. You look at General Motors, just said this summer they're going to put $4 billion into its manufacturing plants, including making trucks in Lake Orion, in Michigan, a long time GM plant. And so I wonder, how do the automakers navigate this tension you're describing between there is competition coming from China? There is an awareness that the future looks different. But on the other hand, Americans like driving big old trucks, and that has been a consistent bet for U.S. automakers over the past 50 years.
Yeah, that's sort of like the several billions and billions dollars question. I think there's a few scenarios, but two kind of jump out to me as the most obvious at the moment. But again, just sort of like total conjecture. There's obviously massive tariffs on China right now, and it's not just the sort of tariffs on goods like the Biden administration imposed this 100% tariff on Chinese-made EVs, which has really been the biggest driver on them coming here much sooner. Which, I don't have the exact current math, but I mean it's a 3-digit massive tariff to bring a Chinese EV over here if you wanted to. Maybe there's a scenario long term where those tariffs just straight up, the EV tariff doesn't go away. Maybe it's not likely, but it is obviously imposed now, and maybe it lasts for a significant amount of time. And in that scenario, maybe the automakers here really do just make trucks and SUVs for a long period of time, and EVs just stay a niche product. I think the other scenario, though, that is still just as possible is one of these companies in China may very well find a way to win over the political, goodwill to build a plant here. And that really would just sort of change the game. If they could start selling cars here that are at these sort of really aggressive price points that you see around the world, and the cars look way different, I think you would just necessarily have to see the domestic automakers start to change. Those are really feel like the only two outcomes where maybe we just sort of regress, and not regress, but just sort of over time just become this permanent major SUV and truck market, whereas everywhere else kind of goes further and further into EVs. Or a company really does find a way just to build here, and which is the way to get around the tariff.
The IRA created all of these incentives, not just the tax credit that we're talking about, but incentives for wind and solar, investments in battery technology. And many of these things have been rolled back. The money's been taken away. It sort of feels like we are in a place right now where there's a lot of kind of half-finished stuff, half-built bits of climate solutions, alternative energy options. And I wonder, when you talk to people who, have the jobs working in the electric battery plant or have invested in these things, where they are left now and what they think is going to happen in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most just sort of recent example that I had was just on this trip to Denver, was talking to some of these dealerships in particular who have really leaned into EVs, which is, again, unique just because of Colorado's space of having the extra incentives to get to, something like 1 out of every 5 cars being sold there is an EV. I mean, they've essentially spent the last 3-4 years courting all of these people to buy an EV and have to really rethink their whole strategy of just, they sell and buy and how to kind of what to do with all of this stuff that they bought, like a standalone charger as like a set piece in the middle of their showroom. Like, do you really need that if you're only selling half as many EVs every month? And I think just from a job standpoint, it definitely, I think at the EV specific plants, like the GM plant in Detroit, for example, is their total EV, they call it factory zero. And I think that there's a lot of just sort of concern that I think people get expressed quite regularly about just the stability and long-term viability of having those jobs. They're not going to really know how much needs to be made, which is just obviously not going to sit well with people who took on one of these jobs to make cars or to sell these kinds of cars.
Ryan Felton, thank you so much for your reporting and for coming on to talk about it.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Ryan Felton reports for the Wall Street Journal. All right, that is it for our show today. What Next TBD is produced by Evan Campbell and Patrick Fort. Our show is edited by Paige Osborne. Mia Lobel is the executive producer at Slate, and TBD is part of the larger What Next family. We'll be back next week with more episodes. I'm Lizzie O'Leary. Thanks for listening.